Hi, welcome to the channel. Whether you're new here or a returning viewer, thank you for joining us. If you're fascinated by real-life stories that unravel the darker layers of human nature, betrayal, and the justice system, you're in the right place. Today, we begin an emotionally charged and deeply unsettling journey into a case that shocked America, the tragic tale of Betty Broderick. Before we dive in, if you find value in our deep dive crime storytelling, don't forget to comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real crime stories, uncovered truths, and investigative breakdowns. In the early hours of November 5th, 1989, two gunshots tore through the silence of an upscale San Diego bedroom. Moments later, 44-year-old Betty Broderick stood in stunned silence, staring at the bloody bodies of her ex-husband and his new wife. But to understand how this picture-perfect housewife became the architect of a brutal double homicide, we must go back 2 decades to the illusion of a perfect marriage and the seeds of resentment that slowly festered underneath. Elizabeth and Bisceglia, known as Betty, was born in 1947 in Bronxville, New York, the third of 6 children in a devoutly Catholic, working-class Italian-American family. Raised with strict values about loyalty, marriage, and duty, Betty was taught that a woman's ultimate role was to be a supportive wife and mother. Her upbringing wasn't unique, but it planted in her a deep belief in the traditional family structure. She met Daniel T. Broderick III in 1965 at the University of Notre Dame. Dan, charismatic and ambitious, was a medical student with big plans. First medicine, then law. They married in 1969, and Betty quickly assumed the role she had been conditioned to play: loyal, hardworking, and tirelessly devoted. She supported Dan financially and emotionally through medical school at Cornell and later Harvard Law School, working part-time jobs and raising their children. Over the next decade, Dan rose through the ranks to become one of the most successful and well-known malpractice attorneys in San Diego. As his wealth grew, so did his influence. He joined country clubs, rubbed shoulders with judges, and built a reputation for being sharp, assertive, and formidable in court. They bought a beautiful home in La Jolla, raised 4 children, and appeared, from the outside, to be the quintessential American dream. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the image of success was a growing rift. Betty's life became increasingly consumed by Dan's career and their children. She sacrificed her own ambitions, friendships, and even her identity to keep the family together. As Dan's power grew, so did the imbalance in their marriage. He was the breadwinner, the decision-maker, the one with social capital, while she was relegated to the background. By the early 1980s, Betty began noticing changes. Dan had hired a new legal assistant, a 21-year-old former airline stewardess named Linda Kolkena. Linda was blonde, attractive, and, to Betty, a symbol of everything she feared: youth, freedom, and temptation. Though Dan denied any affair at the time, Betty's suspicions spiraled. Her accusations were often dismissed by Dan, and her anger, while intense, was written off as irrational jealousy. Yet, as we'll uncover in later parts of the series, Betty's fears were not entirely unfounded. The gaslighting and dismissiveness she endured became psychological fuel, further deepening her emotional turmoil. What's often overlooked in retellings of this case is the massive power imbalance that developed between Betty and Dan. While she had built his empire with him, supported him through every stage, Dan was now a highly connected legal figure in San Diego, earning over $1 million a year. After filing for divorce in 1985, he used his connections and legal expertise to gain favorable custody rulings and financial control. Betty felt increasingly marginalized, not just as a mother, but as a human being. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her children were taken from her custody. And to add salt to the wound, Dan officially moved Linda into the home they had once shared. If you're following the story so far, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Betty was already unraveling, or was this a result of years of emotional control? Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on more thrilling true crime stories. By 1988, Dan and Linda were engaged. Betty, feeling discarded and powerless, had become erratic. She left hundreds of vulgar voicemails, vandalized property, and once drove her car into Dan's front door. The media would later portray her as unhinged, but was this a true psychological breakdown, or the explosive reaction of someone who had been gaslit and isolated for years? By early 1989, Betty Broderick was no longer the suburban housewife the community once admired. She had become consumed by rage, despair, and humiliation. She had been stripped of her financial power, lost her children, and had no legal leverage over her ex-husband. Yet, what many missed during this time was a critical truth. Betty wasn't just reacting to a breakup. She was reacting to a system that had, in her eyes, erased her existence. Dan Broderick was not just her ex-husband. He was her judge, jury, and executioner. With friends in high places and deep knowledge of the law, Dan reportedly maneuvered the court system to his advantage, gaining full custody of their children, selling property without her consent, and threatening her with jail time if she stepped out of line. According to court filings and affidavits from the time, Betty claimed that Dan used legal procedures as weapons of psychological warfare. Betty's behavior grew increasingly erratic. In one instance, she smeared a frosted cake on Dan's clothing. Another time, she drove her car into his front door. These weren't just acts of revenge. They were, in her mind, desperate pleas to be heard. But what made this case even more complex was the silence of those around her. Friends began to distance themselves. Therapists warned her of consequences. But few truly understood the depth of her spiraling mental state. Over the next several months, Betty's communication became venomous. She left hundreds of profanity-laced voicemails on Dan's answering machine. She mailed disturbing letters to his home and office. But again, these weren't just expressions of anger. They were coded messages from a woman who felt erased. Legal experts later examined the dynamic between Dan and Betty, highlighting a phenomenon known as coercive control, a form of psychological abuse where one partner exerts power over another by controlling financial access, legal recourse, and emotional validation. According to Dr. Lenore Walker, a forensic psychologist who testified in Betty's trial, the persistent gaslighting and dismissal of Betty's emotional reality contributed significantly to her breakdown. What complicated the picture further was the role of Linda Kolkena, now Dan's new wife. To Betty, Linda wasn't just the other woman. She was a usurper who had stolen her life, her family, and her future. Reports from friends claim Betty would speak of Linda obsessively, vacillating between hatred and envy. And when Dan and Linda married in April 1989, it was more than Betty could take. Pause here. Do you think Betty was justified in her anger, even if not in her actions? Let us know what you think in the comments. On the night of November 4th, Betty placed a loaded revolver in her purse and drove to Dan's home at 1041 Cypress Avenue. Early that morning, using a key she had taken from one of her daughters, she let herself in. She crept through the house, climbed the stairs, and entered the bedroom where Dan and Linda lay sleeping. At approximately 5:30 a.m., she pulled the trigger. The first bullet hit Linda in the chest. The second missed. The third hit Dan in the chest. 2 more bullets were fired as Linda attempted to crawl out of the bed. Betty then removed the phone from the wall, preventing any emergency call. She drove straight to her daughter's home and confessed. What made this murder especially chilling was not just its execution, but the cold logic behind it. According to her later testimony, Betty claimed she didn't intend to kill, only confront to get their attention. But with 5 shots fired and 4 bullets lodged in the bodies, the evidence painted a much darker truth. The case exploded into national headlines. A beautiful suburban home, a successful lawyer, his much younger new wife, and a bitter ex-wife driven to murder. Within days, tabloids branded Betty as a scorned woman turned psycho. But deeper analysis revealed a disturbing undercurrent: the intersection of domestic manipulation, emotional trauma, and unchecked power. During interrogations, Betty showed little remorse. She spoke about betrayal, about injustice, about being silenced. She believed she had been provoked into madness. Psychiatrists were divided. Some diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. Others believed she was the tragic product of emotional abuse. Stay with us as we unravel the court case, the moral dilemmas it exposed, and the verdict that divided the nation. Take a moment to like this video if you're invested in both sides of this tragic debate. It helps others find and engage with complex true crime stories like this one. On November 5th, 1989, Betty Broderick confessed to shooting her ex-husband, Dan, and his new wife, Linda, in their sleep. The confession was immediate, but the motive, justification, and mental state behind her actions would be the subject of intense scrutiny. Prosecutors charged her with 2 counts of first-degree murder, but what seemed like a straightforward case became anything but. The first trial began in 1990 and quickly captivated the nation. Betty's defense did not deny the killings. Instead, it focused on why she committed them. Her attorneys argued that years of psychological abuse, gaslighting, and legal manipulation had driven her to the edge. They presented Betty as a woman systematically stripped of her identity, control, and dignity. Jurors heard recordings of Dan's voicemails, saw her letters and journal entries, and listened to emotional testimonies from friends and family. But the prosecution painted a different picture. According to Deputy District Attorney Carrie Wells, Betty was not a helpless victim. She was a calculating, angry woman who refused to accept the end of her marriage. They argued she stalked Dan, made repeated threats, and planned the murders well in advance. The fact that she removed the phone from the bedroom wall to prevent any emergency call was framed as evidence of premeditation. The jury deliberated for 9 days. The result? A hung jury. 10 jurors wanted to convict her of second-degree murder. 2 held out for manslaughter. The emotional complexity of the case had divided even those in the jury box. Do you think emotional abuse should impact legal consequences in murder cases? Drop your take in the comments. In 1991, Betty was tried again. This time, prosecutors doubled down on betrayal her as dangerously unstable. They introduced chilling evidence. One of the bullets hit Linda while she was trying to flee, suggesting Betty wasn't just snapping the moment, but systematically ensuring both victims were dead. The defense maintained its argument. This was not a cold-blooded killing, but the culmination of years of mistreatment, humiliation, and legal bullying. But public sentiment had shifted. Many who initially sympathized with Betty began to view her behavior, including vandalism, harassment, and unrelenting aggression, as signs of escalating violence, not desperation. Others saw her as an early symbol of what happens when emotional abuse goes unchecked in high-conflict divorces. On December 11, 1991, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder, Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison, with a possibility of parole. Betty's trial lit a fire under conversations across the country. Was she a monster, or a product of a system that ignored the emotional damage of divorce and coercive control? News outlets were polarized. Daytime talk shows featured fiery debates. Women's rights advocates pointed to Betty as a cautionary tale, not to excuse her actions, but to highlight how emotionally abusive dynamics can destroy mental health. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey, domestic violence expert Dr. Lenore Walker emphasized, "People don't snap in a vacuum." This was a slow erosion of mental stability caused by years of silent suffering. Still, others felt the court had it right. No matter the emotional toll, murder was murder, and Betty had choices. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the trial was the impact on Betty and Dan's 4 children. 2 daughters and 2 sons, caught between the parent they lost and the parent who took them. During sentencing, her eldest daughter, Kim, tearfully pleaded for leniency. "My mom was sick. She didn't need prison, she needed help." But her son, Dan Jr., told a different story. "I believe she knew exactly what she was doing." This emotional split in the family would remain long after the courtroom lights faded, and speaks volumes about the psychological toll these events had on the Broderick children. As Betty Broderick began her life behind bars, the world moved on, but the questions remained. Did the legal system overlook years of emotional abuse? Was this justice served or a missed opportunity to explore the hidden cost of psychological trauma? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story concludes and the moral weight it leaves behind. On December 11, 1991, Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison for the second-degree murders of Dan and Linda Broderick. She was incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino and later transferred to the California Institution for Women in Corona. In many ways, prison didn't break Betty. It solidified her narrative. She continued to insist that she had been provoked beyond reason by a system that ignored the psychological toll of her divorce. In interviews from behind bars, she often sounded composed, even defiant. "I was the perfect wife," she told a San Diego reader. "I made Dan who he was. And when he didn't need me anymore, he tossed me away like garbage." To her supporters, this was the tragic voice of a woman discarded by both a man and a system. To her critics, it was further evidence of her lack of remorse. Betty became eligible for parole in 2010. During her hearings, she was asked repeatedly whether she felt remorse or accepted responsibility. Her responses, while measured, rarely contained the full acknowledgement that parole boards typically expect. She insisted she was the victim of years of emotional and psychological abuse, and that the murders were never planned. She didn't show any insight or real regret. One parole commissioner noted in 2010, she talks about herself as the victim. Her parole requests were denied in 2010, 2011, and again in 2017. Each time, the board cited her lack of remorse and the danger she might still pose if released. What do you think? Should emotional trauma justify parole, or does personal responsibility outweigh pain? Let us know in the comments below. Even decades later, Betty's children remain divided. Her daughters, Kim and Lee, have expressed support for her release, believing she served her time and that her actions were those of a broken woman, not a cold-blooded killer. "I think she's been punished enough," Lee told the Los Angeles Times. "She's not a danger to anyone." But her sons, Daniel Jr. and Rhett, have maintained that their mother remains manipulative and unwilling to take full responsibility. "She did it. She killed them," Daniel Jr. said during a 2010 interview. "And if she gets out, she'll do something else. She hasn't changed." The family split echoes the complex emotional layers of the case, how trauma doesn't end with trial, and how the ripple effects of violence extend for generations. In recent years, the Betty Broderick case has been re-examined through modern lenses, particularly around coercive control, emotional abuse, and how the justice system handles domestic conflict. In 2020, her story was dramatized in Dirty John, the Betty Broderick story, with Amanda Peet portraying her with emotional depth and chilling conviction. The series reignited debate about whether Betty was simply evil, or a tragic case study of how systemic and relational abuse can lead to devastation. Legal scholars and psychologists now use the case in discussions of how mental illness, narcissistic abuse, and the limitations of family court proceedings can combine in dangerous ways. Still, many argue this reflection doesn't excuse Betty's decision to take 2 lives. Like what you're watching? Subscribe for more investigative breakdowns of high-profile cases and overlook human truths. As of 2025, Betty Broderick remains incarcerated in California. She is 77 years old. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for 2032. She has not expressed any significant deviation from her original narrative. She continues to write letters to friends and maintains that she was driven by despair and betrayal, not malice. Her story is not just about murder. It's about marriage, power, perception, and how society judges pain, especially when it's not visible. The Betty Broderick case leaves us with no easy answers. Was she a villain or a victim? A symbol of justice or of its blind spots? What we do know is this: real pain doesn't always look how we expect it to, and the systems built to resolve conflict sometimes inflame it instead. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story resonated with you, hit like, comment your perspective, and subscribe for more deeply researched, emotionally engaging stories that matter. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.